Were there attempts on the part of the State of Israel to recognize the Palestinians' right to exist?
Israel was ready for peace in 1948. I would suggest Israel was ready for peace in 1967. And, you know, the notion that post-67, had there been a response from the Arab world, a peace agreement could have been signed. The notion that somehow the issue was Israel's failure to recognize the Palestinian, I think Palestinians, is to turn history on its head.
Well, I mean, I take your point, and I think we should.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, please. I was just going to say, when Sharon was born, I mean, it was.
I mean, we now have the American diplomatic documents from the 70s.
Yeah.
So everything Rabbi Yoffie said is, of course, what people think is true. It is not true. In 1971, and for the next 2.5 years, Sadat begged the Americans to let him make a separate peace with Israel. It was President Nixon and later Secretary of State Kissinger, National Security Advisor, and Golda Meir who turned that down. So the idea that the Arab world rejected Israel is false. The largest Arab state was very eager to make peace with Israel from 1971 onwards, 4 years after the '67 war, and in fact did make peace with Israel. After Sadat flew to Jerusalem unilaterally in 1977, 2 years later, there was a peace treaty. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think Ahmed's question deserves a response. The problem is not just between the Arab states and Israel. The problem is between Israel and the original majority population of Palestine, which had to be expelled to create a Jewish state in a country which had an Arab majority in 1948. That is a grievance which Israel really, to my way of thinking, has not to this day fully addressed. The red herring of a Jewish state and accepting Israel and so on and so forth is not the real problem. The problem is, when will Israel and Israelis and supporters of Israel come around to addressing the problems that were created by the expulsion of most of the Arab majority of population back in 1948 in order to create a Jewish state in Palestine?
And on that, we had.
I think that's a problem.
Yeah. On that, we had Rashid here a couple months ago talking about his book, My Promised Land, which does face that head-on from the Israeli narrative. And you have people all around the globe talking about what Dr. Khalidi was saying just there. But this gets back to the power vacuum notion that I was talking about before. There are no leaders right now within Israel who have the legitimacy or the stature, the ability to address, in my mind, address what Dr. Khalidi was just saying and still survive politically.
No, certainly. And very quickly, though, I just want to say, I used the qualifier naive before asking you my question. The reason I do so is because I've been asking it for a long time. And the reason I do and seldom get a response is because, at the time that Sharon was born, it was very much the British Mandate of Palestine. And the reason I think it's important to ask these kinds of questions is there seems to be a reluctance to recognize the Palestinian right to even, for example, have a seat at the United Nations, as we saw when things like that are accomplished, and the majority of the world, really, and its delegates recognize that very limited, very elementary level, I would imagine a necessity to actually bring about peace. The Palestinians are punished by Israel, and we saw the announcement of settlements which have long been cited as the ultimate obstacle, both on the actual ground, if you want to talk about facts on the ground, to any peace. So I'm always looking for peace, and I think it's tough to find an avenue for peace when there's not even an avenue for recognition of not only what Dr. Khalidi was mentioning happened on the behalf of Sadat, but even just the very notion of recognizing that there is an equal partner of sorts that is willing to engage with you, and that the burden can't always be, which has now evolved to recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, because for many, repeatedly in the 80s and 90s, the PLO did recognize Israel's right to exist in security, and to my knowledge, Israel has never done that on behalf of the Palestinians.
But throughout those 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s, Israel was also facing certain attacks coming from West Bank, coming from Gaza, coming from southern Lebanon, and that makes a reluctance. Now,
were Palestinians not too facing attacks where disproportionately many people? I mean, we can, this is the argument.
We always go back and forth, but the thing is, you and me agree on most everything until we get to sort of the final status agreement, right?
Yeah.
But even so, right, we're able to have this agreement. We're able to say, I hear your narrative, I understand, and I agree that's necessary to peace.
Right.
But when we're talking about Ariel Sharon and his legacy perhaps of unilateralism, his legacy of perhaps leaving no person to really fully fill his shoes as someone who could defy his party, his backers, his previous legacy, where does that leave us now? Is there someone who can step forward? And I think that's what you're trying to get to.
And Rabbi, I'd be very curious, you know, talking about the legacy and unilateralism, it seems as though Israel's been going it alone increasingly on the international stage in recent years. And, you know, we've heard, and whether this is attributed to just internal domestic politics or not, Justice Minister Tzipi Livni and others who are cautioning against this, as well as the finance minister and others, you know, we're seeing increasing boycotts. Some people are dismissive of them from, you know, Dutch banks and what have you. Dutch firms and pension funds. You know, it just seems to me that there is this isolationist concern, whether it's a reality or a perception. And I'm curious if that is born out of Sharon's legacy of you know, kind of going it alone or unilaterally making decisions that he sees fit to secure Israel.
Well, look, I'm puzzled by the notion that Israel has never recognized the Palestinians. I don't disagree with Professor Khalidi, by the way, about 71, 72 and Sadat. I talked about 67. But I want to suggest to you that Israel was prepared to recognize the Palestinians and move forward on peace at Oslo. It was prepared, I suggest, in the year 2000 under Barak. I suggest it was prepared in 2008 under Olmert. And so the notion that the problem exists solely on the Israeli side and not on the Palestinian side.
Well, I never suggested that.
One that I find very
I didn't
puzzling.
suggest that it's solely, and I think preparing to recognize and actually stepping forward and recognizing, as the Palestinian side has done, are quite different.